Cross Question. On the panel with me tonight, we have Sam Tarry, the Labour MP for Ilford South, Angela Knight, former Conservative MP and Treasury Minister, also former Chief Executive of the trade body Energy UK. Zoe Gardner is a political commentator with a particular focus on asylum and migration policy, and Emma Woolf is broadcaster, journalist and author. They're all here to answer your questions on 0345 6060 973. You can text your call. You can text your question to 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, lots of things you can ask about today. NatWest standing by its boss despite her admitting giving wrong information about Nigel Farage's banking to a BBC journalist. Labour and the Lib Dems are demanding the travel advice to roads is changed to avoid all but essential journeys. Michael Gove says the government won't be delaying its ban on new petrol and diesel cars from the current date of 2030. And an LBC analysis finds that the Just Stop Oil slow marches have so far cost the equivalent of 200 police officers annual salaries. 0345 6060 973. Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Rob in Chislehurst. Actually, it's a text question. Should the NatWest boss really be keeping her job? Now, as I said just now, NatWest says it retains full confidence in its chief executive, Dame Alison Rose, after she admitted discussing Nigel Farage's finances with a BBC journalist and providing him with information which turned out to be wrong. Sam Tarry.
Look, I'm not one to come on and take Nigel Farage's side, but this is pretty concerning stuff. I mean, as a so-called politically exposed person, my own family have had all sorts of issues dealing with, in fact, NatWest, because they had to take documents in and so forth. And I think initially people thought this is what Nigel Farage was tied up in, this additional kind of work that's put in place to stop money laundering and so forth. But clearly, for the most senior executive at a bank to be discussing, even off the record, one of their clients, if that was happening to me or anyone else as a politician or anyone else around this table, I would be pretty concerned. Having said that, obviously, look, if banks have got a particular ethics code, if they were saying, look, we're going to take certain types of people, that's fine. But I'm not sure NatWest are one of those that are saying that. They're not saying we're the co-op and we've got this particularly stringent set of criteria for being able to bank with us. In fact, I think it was Coots. In fact, they're supposed to be the most discerning part of any of the banking system, I suppose, for the kind of ultra uber wealthy. And so, yeah, if I was Nigel Farage, I'd be rightly hopping mad.
Angela, do I remember right? Didn't you run the British Banking Association at one point?
I did, through the last...
My memory is much better than I thought it was.
Fantastic. Through the banking crisis. I actually took that job on April Fool's Day, just before the run on the Northern Rock. So, I mean, that just tells you something, that you must never go and take on a new job on April Fool's Day. But, yes, I've been following this story. I mean, I have no comfort to anybody around this table or to any politician who's listening to it, because it's, 25 years since I lost my seat in 1997. I am still classed as a politically exposed person. So you can't ever get away with it. Or I don't mean with it, I mean get away from it is the word I should have used. And so I think that begs the question...
Banking equivalent of herpes.
Have we? Well, I think it begs the question, have we got this regime right? Now, I do think it's perfectly proper that a bank could say, I'm targeting a certain section of society. We have some, for example, who do Sharia banking, but not everybody does Sharia banking. So everybody shouldn't have to do everything. Coots targets people with a certain amount of wealth. That's fine. Make it clear. Here, I think we've got two things, and they have collided. The first is that somehow this politically exposed person regime has been used in a way for which it was never intended. And that is to say, here's an individual, they maybe in a certain category, they butt up against our values and therefore we're not going to have them. So I think that I'm concerned about, and the fact that he was never told. The second issue, which shouldn't really be confused with the first, other than it's the same individual in Nigel Farage, and that is that a customer's personal situation was discussed at a dinner table and information revealed by an individual.
But you
who
can
knew it.
kind of see
I
how
think
the
those two are
conversation
wrong.
went, because it was a charity dinner, and Simon Jack, the BBC's business editor, I think was sitting next to Dame, what's her name, Alison something or other, Alison Rose.
That's what everybody says.
And so if I was him, of course
I'd ask
it was
the
the
question.
day. So I'd say, well, what's gone on here then? Because he's saying that you did this, and she would have said, no, we didn't do that, but probably went over the top in the amount of detail that she went into.
What she should have said is, look, I can't discuss an individual's personal details. I simply can't. It's not right. We now call it GDPR. We used to call it, reasonable secrecy, confidentiality. And I do think it begs the question. I mean, she's still in the job. Yeah, fine, okay. That's a decision of the board. But there are a couple of very strong messages here. Privacy is privacy. Confidentiality is confidentiality. We have a right not to have our affairs discussed in public. And secondly, we also have a right, if we have been turfed out from a bank, let alone, there's a difference between sacking somebody as a customer and not taking them on, we have a right to know. There is a list of the OFAC list and other blacklists that take place, and that's quite right. That's individuals engaged in fraud, it's individuals involved in terrorism. So there is that big list, and you check that as a bank in the first instance, and you keep checking against it. This is not the case in this instance. Somehow there is a line which we all know there has to be, and that line in this instance, in my view, has been crossed. So I think it's a very great pity.
Do you think she should step down?
I'm not going to start throwing stones at people. I didn't like it when it was throwing stones at myself. Clearly the board has taken a view, and that is where the decision should be taken. Much as we would all like to comment around a table, actually the board does carry the responsibility, and the board has made a decision.
Zoe Gardner.
Yeah, well, I have to agree that, again, somebody who doesn't have a huge amount of generalised sympathy with Nigel Farage, I do agree with the point you've been making about confidentiality, and I do agree that there need to be clear and unbending and no exceptions to the rules by which everybody can bank, and political differences there shouldn't come into play and shouldn't prevent somebody from banking with the bank. But I'm more interested really in the narrative that has been developed around this. And Nigel Farage, I mean, he really is the king of playing the victim, isn't he?
Well, he is the victim here.
He is the victim here, but he's claimed that there's an elite conspiracy against him, that he's being targeted by the establishment. And when you're looking at who's the elite in society, I think the person who's been banking with a bank where you have to have a minimum of £1 million to open an account.
Or not, as we find out.
Or not quite, maybe just below. And who gets the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary tweeting up in their defence as soon as something happens to them like this, then I think you're being shown who the real elites are in this country. So much as I do agree that this shouldn't have happened to him, it sounds like a disaster and a mess. I do think that, the sort of victimhood narrative of being some kind of establishment stitch up against him is preposterous.
Well, I thought that when he first did that video on this, I thought it was outrageous that the bank hadn't told him why they were withdrawing the account, so I tweeted that. But I did think the establishment bit was a bit of Nigel Farage bluster. But having read that document that Coates wrote about him, I mean, you can see why he's come to that conclusion, I think. Emma Woolf.
Well, I'm the only one in the room who has any sympathy with Nigel Farage. I work with him at GB News. He's a top bloke and he's a very intelligent man. So actually, when you actually listen to the narrative of what's gone on, and we all know, of course, it's the establishment against him because he expresses views that are slightly to the right of centre, and that's not acceptable anymore.
Slightly to the right of centre.
Yes. To the right of centre, and that's not acceptable anymore. It wouldn't have been the other way around if it... Look, this is a serious, serious breach of confidentiality, and what worries me more is this idea that the banks are going to start picking and choosing. I mean, you've all made the point that you're public, you have public profiles and whatever. I don't care whether you have a public profile or you're a private individual. I think this is really, really alarming. What next? Are our utility companies going to start withdrawing our electricity and water supply? Are GPs going to start looking at our social media tweets and judging us and saying, actually,
God, I hope not.
You've expressed views? No, this is serious. Schools, churches, people are going to start rejecting our custom because we have views that don't... This is what they said. They didn't align, Nigel's views didn't align with their values.
Can I jump in on this, because that is actually where my concern lie.
This is what my concern is.
That you've got values one side, and certainly in the financial services industry, having values and ethos and all that sort of thing. It's important as far as your customers are concerned. It's important as far as your employees are concerned. But it's also the regulator has taken a stance on this, which you, as a financial service industry and a bank in this instance, has to abide by. And I start off to get a bit worried about that.
I get worried because what happens when an electricity
so-
company says, we're not going to provide you with electricity because you're a racist, you're a fascist.
so
there
this-
are all sorts of loathsome people
so-
out there who need basic services.
So this brings
and I'm
me-
afraid they need to have them supplied.
So this brings me to my second point, in that what Nigel Farage has done is not started something that is new. He, because whether you like him or not, because he's prepared to play a public stance, and he doesn't care that it might be a risky or somewhat concerning situation, has put into the public domain something that has been creepingly happening for some time.
But you talk as though he's an extremist.
No, I don't. What I say about him
Brexit was voted for with a majority.
I'm not bothered about that. I think you've missed my point. My point is rather different. My point is that Nigel Farage can be brave where some people are not so brave. They're not so brave because they think that there's going to be some adverse consequence.
Well, what he's
and
highlighted...
because he has taken this stance, he has shown up a situation that has been creeping for some time, in that more and more people, and not necessarily what you might refer to the establishment, though it is a fair point that you make, have found themselves in some difficulties in respect of just losing their banking
Sam,
services.
you must have
I'm
had
glad that he said
Muslim
it.
constituents in this situation where they've just been denied bank accounts. I'm told that this happens regularly with no explanation whatsoever. And those people haven't got the platform that Nigel Farage has got. And I think he's actually done us all a favour by doing this, because whatever the truth of it or not, I suspect the banks are going to be very careful about how they handle this in the future.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. There's always people who are unable to have that huge platform to stand up for themselves. And I think, look, if anyone's saying that they're surprised that these sorts of things go on, what brought to my mind in particular, sort of what you just said as someone from GB News, was that, I think of the blacklisted workers. I think of the people that were provided lists by the police so that companies could stop people working up and down this country. Thousands of people lost their jobs. Or I think about the very anodyne protest groups and sort of peacenik groups which were infiltrated by the police. These are the serious conversations I think we need to be having.
I agree.
I mean, it's not quite clear with Nigel Farage exactly what has gone on. It's certainly not an elite conspiracy. But when the state is intervening in the lives of people in a way that they are not at all aware of, that is actually something that's really concerning.
One thing which I think sort of wider point here is that when this first happened, when he first made that video, and I then tweeted it's outrageous that they haven't told him a reason, I was assailed by people who would normally describe themselves as defenders of civil liberties, human rights and all the rest of it, saying, ha ha ha, it's Nigel Farage.
Exactly.
He shouldn't be allowed a bank account anyway. And I'm thinking, you are such hypocrites because you've just become not civil libertarians, but crypto-fascists.
I totally agree with you.
And while I
And
agree
no
with
one's
that,
pretending
I would like
he's
to
going to
add
be.
that there are groups of people who are denied bank accounts in this country.
Yeah, you're
So
right.
migrants with insecure status are not entitled to open a bank account in this country.
Well, HSBC have now got a scheme where they can.
I'm very interested to hear about that, because what the government policy currently creates is a situation where bank tellers are forced to play the role of border guards, are forced to check people's immigration status, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of different papers you could have to prove different types of immigration status. These are not trained border guards. And so people are wrongly targeted by these measures to prevent them from being able to open bank accounts, to operate in, the regular economy. So there's lots of much more marginalised groups of
I
people
think,
who
to
are
be fair,
impacted by these
the
measures.
scheme I'm thinking of, and I did look it up, if it's on the internet, just type in HSBC, but I think I typed HSBC homeless because I think it's directed at homeless people who don't have an address, rather than maybe the kind of people that you're talking about there. Anyway, interesting discussion. Let's continue it, but on a different subject in just a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. You're listening to LBC. It's 16 minutes past 8.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Sam Tarry is here with us, Labour MP for Ilford South, Angela Knight, former Conservative MP and Treasury Minister, Zoe Gardner, political commentator, and Emma Woolf, broadcaster, journalist and author. Right, let's go to another text. It's from James in Gillingham. What did you make of Rishi Sunak's libellous tweet about Labour's connection to criminal people smuggling gangs? You may think this is made up. It isn't, I promise you. The Prime Minister tweeted today that, quotes, the Labour Party, a subset of lawyers, criminal gangs, are all on the same side, propping up a system of exploitation that profits from getting people to the UK illegally. Now, if I'm being kind, I say, well, that was obviously written by one of his underlings and he would have never seen it, but it still went out under his name. Don't know the truth of that, but that's not exactly a very prime ministerial tweet. I think he was responding to the story in the Daily Mail where they'd done some expose of lawyers who were advising people how to get into this country and basically going around the system. Zoe, let's come to you first.
Yeah, well, I hadn't seen that tweet, but I mean, it's sort of part of a pattern now of these increasingly desperate, sort of ridiculous statements made by this government. But I think what's really ironic about it is that if I were a smuggler or a trafficker or a slaver, I would most certainly be voting Conservative at the next election. Their immigration and asylum policy currently reads like a slaver's charter.
How so?
Well, there's various ways in which that's the case. For example, they've removed the possibility for victims of trafficking to obtain protection if they've entered the UK through irregular means. That includes if they were trafficked against their will into the UK through irregular means. They cannot access protection as victims of trafficking, so it's impossible for them to escape from their traffickers and get the protection of the state. There's also another story out today that shows that there's been a huge increase in people being referred to the modern slavery referral mechanism from the care sector. And that's also a major problem in seasonal agricultural work. And that's because the type of visas that they run for these lower paid areas of work are incredibly restrictive, don't allow people to change employer with ease. And so if they are in situations of exploitation under one employer, if they were to leave that employer, they would lose their right to live in the UK, their right to continue to work in the UK. So people become trapped in abusive situations. And that's in a context where the government's independent commissioner for anti-slavery has resigned because of the government's policies that run directly counter to their recommendations. There was the Labour Enforcement Commissioner's job stood open for 2 years and was only recently filled, and the agenda for inspection and enforcement of standards in the workplace has just simply not been a priority for this government. So we have a situation where rife exploitation in the workplace is a completely high reward, low risk operation for these criminal gangs. They operate across borders. The government has said we won't be helping the people who are their primary victims. They're creating a situation for criminality to thrive in our communities.
Angela.
Well, I didn't see the tweet either. I mean, I'm so pathetic. I don't actually have a Twitter account. So,
or an X account.
Or an X account, yeah, even I know that bit. I can accept some of the concerns that have been raised. Clearly I can. But the reality of immigration is that the individuals themselves have passed through a lot of countries before they get here. And so that has...
I do have to interrupt, I'm sorry, because in many cases we're talking about care workers who are not illegal migrants.
You don't have to interrupt. You let Angela speak and then we'll have a debate afterwards.
Okay, sure. And so... you've put me off, but don't worry, I will get back on track. Nevertheless, they have come through a number of countries before they've got here to the UK. I think we've all been very concerned about seeing the boats cross the Channel. Frankly, I think it's pretty difficult to watch the boats that are crossing the Mediterranean. We are living at a time in which there's a huge east-west migration and south-north migration taking place. And you cannot just open your borders.
Well,
you have to
let's just concentrate on this tweet, though, because it as I said, I don't think it's a very prime ministerial tweet, but
I'm not going to disagree with you on that. The tweet may be the tweet is the tweet. The issue is still there, irrespective of whether we like the language in the tweet or not. There is a significant amount of illegal immigration taking place. There has to be some real stance taken if we're going to get this into a proper framework, and we have people who are coming in where there's a route, where it's decided, where it's agreed beforehand, where criminal gangs are sidelined. I think the criminal gang bit is very, very disturbing indeed. I was very minded of a statement that was made by my former boss, which was Ken Clarke, in the House of Lords over this particular issue, and it was in the last few days, where he said, there's a lot of objections to the current policy, but nobody has yet come up with an alternative. And I do think that if you object to something, you've got to come up with an alternative. I do think that we're dealing with a situation where, yes, there's quite a large number of legal immigration takes place in this country, but the illegal comes through other countries first. It is driven by criminal gangs, and there does have to be steps taken against it,
Sorry,
of which the legal profession is part. They do have to play a part in not causing more problems than they're solving.
Zoe.
Yeah, so the point, and I'm sorry for interrupting and putting you off your flow, but you caught it again brilliantly. The point I was trying to make is that I specifically spoke not just about people who have come seeking asylum, but also that the government's approach to migration is extremely harmful and puts people at risk of slavery and exploitation when they are coming to work in seasonal agricultural work, in care work, in all sorts of other lower paid areas of the economy. And that is found, like there are as many people who came last year to work in seasonal agricultural work on those visas as came across in small boats. Now, we never talk about them, but there's literally as many people came. And the government's own review of its visa system that by which those people come, so perfectly legally, entitled, given permission by the government to come, found that in a quarter of the, 1 in 10 farms that they did bother to inspect, there were serious concerns raised, including issues of modern slavery and trafficking. So we're not just talking about an issue that is easy to sort of scapegoat and say, oh, well, this is all people who shouldn't be here. We're talking about people that we desperately need in our country, who are being put on these extremely restrictive visa conditions that are, every bit of evidence shows us, the ILO says it, so the International Labour Organization says it, it's been shown to be the same repeatedly in every other country where it's been tried. These extremely restrictive visa situations leave people at the mercy of exploitation and smuggling.
And that's why we have modern slavery laws, which we didn't have 10 years ago.
No, we haven't. Yeah, our modern slavery laws are still there. You may not quite like them, but they're still
drastically
there.
reduced access to them in various ways. So the Illegal Migration Act that just passed into law and received royal assent this week drastically reduces the number of people who are entitled to receive protection as victims of trafficking, even if they are victims of trafficking.
But you've just been talking
irrelevant.
I've just interrupted.
But I mean, the Modern Slavery Act was brought in by a Conservative government when Theresa May was Home Secretary.
Yeah.
I'm saying none, but most of the measures in that were not there in the law before. So therefore, the authorities have recourse to the law if any authority finds that these laws are being transgressed.
But there is no inspection carried out to enforce the standards that are in the law.
You just said there were.
Well, I said that 1 in 10 of the farms were inspected. 1 in 10 of the farms, one site on each of those, which each of them have hundreds of sites, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of farms across that period of a year. And what was found was that in 25% of cases, there were serious concerns about exploitation and in some cases modern slavery.
And was action taken?
No, absolutely no action. Literally zilch. Nothing has been done about this.
That is a scandal. Right, let's go to Sam Tarry. Let's go back to the question, because James has actually texted me saying they're not answering my question. What did you make of Rishi Sunak's libellous tweet about Labour's connection to criminal people smuggling gangs?
Well, look, Labour's lawyers can decide whether it's libellous. The clear point here for me is this is the desperate rhetoric of a failing government. You know, we just talked
You were
about...
a bit like Keir Starmer's advert, saying that essentially saying that Rishi Sunak was a paedophile sympathiser.
And I came on this programme and said I didn't support that at the time as well. You know, I'm consistent, if nothing else. I mean, look, the thing is here, you know, we are seeing, and I've seen this when I've been, you know, fighting the far right over many decades in different corners of this country, that when a government or an organisation is failing, they reach for always the lowest common denominator. As Zoe has very eloquently explained, the biggest problem here in terms of migration is about how you actually organise that through the visa system. I deal with that in the tens of thousands as an MP with one of the most diverse constituencies in the country. The focus on small boats, of clearly no one in this room would want those small boats to be coming across the channel in the dangerous way that they are. It's terrifying and it's terrible. But the point of the government demonising these people, attacking these people, is to create this continued enemy within. It's just cannon fodder for the tabloid newspapers. It's blame the lowest common denominator, you know, and actually it always diverts attention from the catastrophic failings of this government that have devastated our economy. Our economy is not on its knees. The housing crisis is not so desperate. Inflation is not through the roof because of thousands of people fleeing war-torn countries coming across the channel. And anyone that tells you that is a liar and deluded, and that is where Rishi Sunak is headed, and it's very dangerous.
Emma, I've got to ask you to be reasonably brief, I'm afraid.
Well, to get back to the tweet, this is no less libellous. Iain, you've taken the words right out of my mouth. This is no less libellous than the attack ads from Labour a couple of months ago, effectively accusing Rishi Sunak of being, of allowing child offenders,
so we've got 18 months of this to go,
offenders.
haven't we?
Exactly. This is the point. It's ramping up. It's going to get nastier and nastier. This is mudslinging. They were accusing, it was wildly inaccurate. It was offensive. It was completely off the wall because Rishi Sunak wasn't actually, I don't think he'd been an MP for a few years, but it was nothing to do with the Home Office at the time. So, you know, to talk about these desperate, as Zoe calls them, desperate statements from this government, well, who started it? I mean, this is the way it goes.
And I agree with you, Labour's desperate too.
And one of the problems about all this is actually it destroys our democratic institutions if all it is mudslinging. And I do have a real concern that the more you sling mud unfairly, unreasonably and aggressively...
I think a huge amount of people have switched off.
They
and
switch
huge
off,
amount of disaffection. And I think that at the next election there will be record low turnouts.
I think that there will be, and that's, you know, and we want a democracy. We don't want
what do we vote for? Look at this. Look at this shower.
We saw in the Selby and Hasty by-election where the Conservative vote went down by 2/3.
Yeah, they all stayed at home.
And that's because they all stayed at
home.
And I think
Sam
this sort
accepted,
of thing,
of course.
this sort of thing is going to make even more people stay at home.
And I think Keir Starmer's is in exactly the same thing of just slinging mud.
Right, keep the calls coming. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31. Tim Daly has the LBC News headlines.
Labour is urging the government to rethink its travel advice for places like the Greek islands as tens of thousands of Britons remain in limbo over their holiday plans. The Foreign Office hasn't advised people to avoid places like Rhodes, so holidaymakers who choose not to go could lose their money. 6 men have been convicted over the 2016 Brussels terror attacks that killed 32 people. Islamic State exploded bombs at the Belgian capital's airport and on a metro train. And NatWest says it still has full confidence in its chief executive, despite her admission to a serious error of judgment over the Nigel Farage row. Dame Alison Rose discussed the former UKIP's leader's finances with journalists as he accused Coates of closing his account for political reasons. LBC weather: showers for parts of northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland, largely clear elsewhere overnight with a low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:34, we've got quite an argumentative panel tonight. We have Sam Tarry, Labour MP for Ilford South, who, to be fair, has been the voice of sweet reason so far, but the nice
voice of the sensible left. That's why.
He's behaving himself from now until the next election.
Angela Knight, former Treasury Minister for the Conservatives, Zoe Gardner, political commentator, and Emma Woolf, broadcaster, journalist and author. 0345 6060 973, that's the number that Lawrence in Wembley has called. Hi, Lawrence.
Good evening, Ian, and good evening, panel. My question to the panel is, I think at the moment this country is experiencing a mortgage pandemic. So should government give financial support to people with unaffordable mortgage payments, particularly people on the bottom of the scale who are on benefits?
Well, some good news tonight. HSBC are apparently going to be the first lender to begin reducing their interest rates. So some good news for mortgage holders there. Emma Woolf, I asked you to be brief in the last one. The floor is yours.
Dare not hold forth on this one with Angela Knight in the room. I would prefer look, I think already the economy is in the doldrums after giving so much money in furlough schemes over the last couple of years and effectively putting the economy into the deep freeze for a couple of years. I dread to think what's going to happen if we then start giving people mortgage help on that scale. I would prefer the government to, if they're going to target this kind of help, if they're going to put money towards this kind of thing, I'd much prefer them to talk to the Bank of England, talk about decreasing interest rates and increasing interest rates on savings and being fair to everybody in that way, dealing with the economy in that way, rather than targeting specific mortgage help at those on the lower end of the spectrum, because then I worry, what about people who don't even have mortgages? What about people who are just paying crazy rents all over the country, have absolutely no rights? There are so many financially insecure people, whether they have mortgages or not, whether they have property or not, they can be in a really desperate situation. You know, the thing that really is getting people at the moment is things like, food price inflation that isn't coming down, that is sticky, that is stubborn, that is really something you can't avoid. Low-income families who literally have to feed their children. So that's my concern. I would really like the government to get control of that, to work with the Bank of England, however you do that, technically. I don't care how you do it. But when you talk about things like reducing income tax, that doesn't affect, lower income people. So, yeah, that would be...
OK. Sam Tarry.
Clearly, we're going to have to take some pretty drastic action if we get to a point in the next sort of 18 months. If hundreds of thousands of people are going to default on their mortgages, that is going to be really serious. We have a credible housing crisis. I think the thing is, it's not either or. For me, we ought to be on one hand talking about, in my view, linking, for example, average wages in an area to the maximum rent that someone can put in place. People call that a rent cap, for example, because that, I agree, rent,
which Labour set their faces against.
The Mayor of London has certainly talked about it, and it's obviously an ongoing debate. And I think it's one that needs to continue to happen, because clearly that housing crisis, whether it's people defaulting on mortgages in the future, which is a real danger, or people at the moment who literally are spending maybe as much as 70 to 80% of their entire monthly income just to pay the rent, how on earth they pay all those other energy bills? It's kind of like if more people then are needing to rent because they've lost their mortgage, that's just going to worsen the situation. I don't think it's as simple as saying, OK, let's not give more government largesse, of course, right? But we are in a situation where the government over the past 18 months have literally tanked the economy. They've not got a grip on inflation. It's completely out of control. And the one thing that I think so many politicians seem afraid to say, but I'll certainly say it on this programme tonight, the main driver of inflation is not people's wages. It's the absolutely rabid scale of corporate profit in this country. When you've got top FTSE 350 companies posting since 2019 record profits, that is the driver of food prices, of fuel prices, of the prices that people are paying every single day. And, any politician that's got the guts to stand up and actually say, that's the problem in this country, we're going to tackle that. We're going to actually try and create a more sustainable and equal society. And we do that, first of all, through, helping people by building the houses that need to be built, by putting rental caps in place and, making sure that the banks are equipped in the best way possible. And that could be through regulatory frameworks, or it could be having a discussion about what money we may need to put into the economy to stop hundreds of thousands of people defaulting on their mortgages.
But I mean, I remember back in the early 1990s when I got my first mortgage, which was, I think, £58,000 for a 2-bedroom flat in Walthamstow. And interest rates very quickly went up to 14%. I don't remember thinking that the government should therefore bail me out because I'd made the decision.
Sure,
Surely individuals...
58,000 is different.
I know, but 14%, believe me.
Yeah, but 58,000 is very different to a flat of that thing now being 400, 500,000.
Of course, absolutely. But proportionally, it's not that different because there was a housing boom just before that. But individual responsibility has to come in here. The problem is that since the end of the 1990s, we haven't really seen interest rates at a normal rate of... I mean, the normal interest rate is 4 or 5%, but we've all got if you're under 40... You don't remember these times. And I've constantly said, if you can't afford a mortgage, if mortgage rates are going up to 5, 6, 7%, don't get one.
Then,
if you build an entire
but wages
on people's personal debt, whether that be mortgages, whether it be credit cards, and that is something that the government and the banking sector have encouraged and has been driven by the City of London, then we've got a real problem of our hands. Because, of course, if you're buying a house for £58,000 and the rate is 14%, the problem is now, look at how much the house is worth compared to most people's salaries. That's the problem. And so actually, obviously, that percentage is far greater in terms of the actual financial...
It's now worth 340,000.
Well, there you go. That's a huge amount of unearned wealth. Maybe we should be campaigning for land value tax.
I wasn't earning quite what I am today. Zoe?
Well, I mean, I take what you say about people, preferably avoiding getting into debt, but actually it's way beyond the point of individual people's control here. We're talking about a government where, 131,000 children are now homeless. That's record levels of child homelessness because they have... I mean, that should do for any government just on its own, right? You presided over record levels of child homelessness. That should do for you on its own. But the reason why that has happened, you say people shouldn't take a mortgage they can't afford. People have been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed because there has been a total abject failure to grapple with the reality that we need to build more social housing. And I will say this until I'm blue in the face, the government has failed us every single year. It has failed to meet its own targets, which were insufficient, year on year on year, to build affordable housing in this country. And it will simply continue to be an unsustainable market where renters are priced out, where mortgage holders are priced out, where a small group of people who are lucky enough to own their own houses outright are completely insulated from this issue and in many cases may own multiple properties and be making obscene profits out of people's misery in this market. It is absolutely unsustainable. Housing is a fundamental human right. Everybody needs it. It's not a nice to have. A mortgage is not a nice to have. It is something that we all need, and the government has failed to build those houses.
Zoe, do you mean children in insecure housing? Sorry, but
so
you don't mean
temporary
homeless.
accommodation.
You don't.
Homeless covers.
All right, but you don't. There are 130,000 children on the street in this country.
No, of course not. Okay. Homelessness covers sofa surfing. It covers people staying with a friend or in. No, not renting. I'm talking about people who can't afford to rent, who are in between places, who are staying maybe in transactional sexual relationships.
I'm asking about children.
Yeah, there was a report out today that shows that we have these record numbers. That's where I get the 131,000.
We've got hundreds and hundreds of people in my constituency. I could take you people living in bed and breakfasts, people living in places you'd call a hotel that probably is a worse accommodation than putting your kids into Pentonville prison. I see that every day in my office. So Zoe's absolutely spot on.
What do you say to somebody who comes to your surgery in those circumstances? Because you're probably their last hope in a sense, but I remember when I worked for an MP back in the mid-80s, it wasn't a constituency where you would get a lot of these things, but they are pinning their hopes on you to change their lives. And you can't do it, can you? What do you say to people?
It can be really difficult because obviously, look, there's certain things we can do. If the local authority hasn't done their job properly, we'll kick off with them and maybe something can happen there. Often have, we've got maybe 4 local authorities that we often argue with. But at the end of the day, they can do things and improve things. But actually, the bottom line is there isn't enough affordable housing. There isn't enough social housing and that unfashionable word of council housing. If we built 1 million council houses, our entire housing crisis would probably be solved within almost overnight. Instead, what we've got is corporate property speculators, even in my constituency, building huge skyscrapers with starting prices of hundreds of thousands of pounds that not a single local family could expect to get their kids into. I mean, ask any sort of parent in their 50s and 60s why their 30 and 40-year-old children are now living at home. It used to be the norm in Italy. It's now the norm in loads of major cities, including London, all across the country. Something's fundamentally wrong. Right. And I tell you what, the political party that really actually delivers on this could expect, in my view, to return 2 or 3 terms of government.
I think if Keir Starmer tomorrow said we're going to build 1 million council houses by the time of the end of the first Labour government, I think that would be transformational. But they're not going to do it, are they? Angela?
We'll push them.
And if they did do it, then there'd be a huge number of people objecting to the planning. They didn't want their...
On both sides.
They wanted the housing in theory, but they didn't want
it in their backyard.
They wanted it in somebody else's.
Like the MP for South Cambridgeshire.
I'm afraid it just goes on and on, this sort of thing. Can I come back to the actual question, though, if that's all right, which is all about mortgages and the difficulty that some people are experiencing with their mortgages, or they will do as they start to have to remortgage their loan. I mean, the first thing is I come from that generation which was kind of used to high inflation rates and high interest rates, and it wasn't just once; it was frequently. And the current last 18 years, approximately that is the artificial period of very low interest rates. It's not the norm, but it's fair enough me saying that. The reality is it's been the norm for so many people. And what the banking industry and the mortgage providers, because it's not just from banks, of course, it's building societies, are doing at the moment with people whose mortgage needs to be renewed, is they're giving several options. They are giving an extended period in some instances under the current borrowing rate that the people agreed with that mortgage. The second thing that they're allowing you to convert for a short period of time. The short, I cannot tell you what it is, 2 years, 3 years, it depends on individuals, from having both a capital and interest repayment mortgage to an interest only, i.e. you keep your monthly payment the same, and you'll have it for a shortish period of time. When things get better or or things improve for yourself, then you can remortgage again. And then there's a whole forbearance piece in there as well. And that's why, actually, although there's been an awful lot of talk and an awful lot of concern, and rightly so, about people looking at what is happening to mortgage rates, the reality is that at the moment, I believe about 40% of those that were coming up this year have already been dealt with by one of those 3 routes for people who simply could not afford that monthly payment. So yes, you're right to raise the issue, and it is being handled. A couple of other points, if I may, on the back of this, is we do tend to look very strongly, as do policymakers, at the situation in the southeast, where there has been this huge increase in house prices, and people are looking at the affordability thing, and it becomes eye-watering, and it's the bank of mum and dad that helps you along. Get out of the southeast and 1 or 2 other pockets, and you don't have anything like that same sort of pressure on land, pressure on housing. And although you have had a significant increase in the house prices, it hasn't been this sort of disproportionate increase that we've had in the southeast. Another aspect is on the affordable housing. And because the affordable housing targets tend to be agreed with a local authority and the builders who are coming in, and it's financed in lots of different ways, as you know. And there are quite a number of parts of this country now where that affordable housing target has been met for that area. In the southeast, it's miles adrift. So as we think about housing policy, we can't say it's one thing right across the country. It isn't. Just like commuting isn't the same across the country. Roads aren't the same across the country. Our country is in different regions, as are many other countries. And we need to think about it clearly. And you're absolutely right to raise the emotional bit, but I'm going to be rotten back to you and say, in an unemotional and logical way, bring up the data and sort it in the different areas. But the more and more you get this huge pressure of people coming down to the southeast, the more you will increase the problem that there is in this area. And you're the Earl of London, and so, I quite understand that what I've just said. A lot of people of your listeners will say, well, I don't care about that. It's a problem in London. It is a problem in London, you're right.
Well, it is a problem all over the country because,
but not to the same extent, is my point.
And Angela,
but there are you said there are pockets. That almost indicates you think there aren't that many, but there are huge amounts all over the country, not just in urban centres. But I think of sort of some of the smaller market towns where it's almost the village I grew up in Essex, 750 population there, almost impossible for a normal person to buy a property there anymore.
But then I throw it back to you and I say to you, who is it who actually decides with the builders what their target is for affordable housing in the area? And the answer is it's the local authority. It isn't some government
so
target
many of the
set on
Tory-controlled
your
local
villages.
authorities aren't interested in building it. They don't want any more building in their areas.
I'm not going to defend that because I agree that we have got a housing problem.
I'm glad because we're massively over time in this bit of the programme. It's 8:49.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Sam Tarry, Angela Knight, Zoe Gardner and Emma Woolf answering your questions. Here's a text question from Eddie in Hemel Hempstead. Should the parties use environmental policies for political points? We can't afford to unless we want to be like roads in the future. Well, obviously, we all know what's going on in Rhodes and one or two other places in the Mediterranean at the moment. But of course, we've had the mood music on the environment, particularly from the Prime Minister at the moment, I think is to sort of slightly row back from some of the commitments that have been made at the various COP summits. Zoe, let's come to you first.
Yeah, well, I think that the person texting in is absolutely right. I am absolutely terrified. I plan on sticking around on this planet for another good few decades, I hope. And
me too.
Yeah, no. And I think that it's no longer the case that the conversation is sort of like, oh, well, our kids, what will they face? It's literally what we're going to face in the next sort of 20-odd years. We're not on track to hit 1.5 degrees of warming. And I have to say that at 2 degrees of warming, at 2.5 degrees of warming, God forbid at 3, which is what we're on track for right now, we're looking at the one and only survival adaptation behaviour that is viable for the species in large parts of the world will be migration, right? That is our best survival strategy and has been throughout our existence as a species. And what we're looking at 2-3 degrees of global warming is we're looking at not just people from the global south having to make those heart-wrenching decisions to leave their homes behind when it becomes totally unviable to live there. We're talking about the south of Europe. We're talking about Spain, Greece, Italy becoming unlivable within the next 20 years. And we absolutely need to start taking this seriously. I've been hugely disappointed by the narrative coming out of the by-elections this week that somehow has turned into an anti-green policy narrative instead of however many brilliant narratives it could have been. From my perspective, it's truly a feat of pathetic political mismanagement from the Labour side, at least. Sorry, Sam. To have allowed the story to become one about who's going to backtrack on green policies instead of one about how we need green policies to be linked with economic justice policies so that people who are bearing the brunt of issues like pollution and climate change are not economically disadvantaged further by the changes that we desperately need to make and desperately need to make much faster than we have been making in order to make that transition to a world that will be livable for all. And at the moment we're going so far in the wrong direction. We're talking about opening new coal mines. I mean, it's 2023. These people are on glue and nobody young is ever going to vote for them again. I'm telling you that. This will not be forgiven and it will start to impact, it's starting to impact us now. It will start to impact us in ways that will be unavoidable and unignorable and unsweep under the carpetable within the next 5 to 10 years.
That's a new word you just invented there.
I enjoyed it, actually.
Emma.
Well, I agree with your caller, texter, whoever the communicator was. Environmental issues should not be party political. It should not be short-term. They need long-term strategy. It can't just be a 5-year thing when we're talking about the environment. The problem is, I think everybody wants to be cleaner and greener, but actually nobody wants to stop driving. No one wants to stop flying. No one wants to stop eating meat. Well, I don't eat meat, but anyway. No one wants to really... Such
a lefty, Emma. I've always thought it.
Pay the green... I just don't eat things with a face or with a heart. And, I think that, so, I mean, or the people don't want to pay their green levies. So I think we need to be realistic about this. The fact is, extreme weather isn't a new thing. I'm not saying anything against climate change. Extreme weather is not a new phenomenon. In the early 20th century, there were floods in China which killed millions and millions of people. Look at the American Dust Bowl. There has been extreme weather throughout history, but we hear about it now instantly. We see it. We see the impact. It feels so much more vivid. I'm going back to the Rhodes fires, the wildfires. It's so much more vivid. We see it, we hear the footage, we see it all on camera instantly, immediately. So I think we need to be aware and not to catastrophise. Zoe, I think you are verging on catastrophising there, where you talk about how we're actually going to live on this planet with 3 degrees.
Well,
we just don't know.
We can live on this planet in the
Things
global
go back
north,
and
we have a huge opportunity to
it's
use
July,
those
and it's cool here,
right.
and it's raining.
Let me jump in.
If we look at the clock, jump in, be quick, and then we have time for Sam as well.
OK, so I'm an engineer, and one of the things that I've never seen out of any of the political parties...
I wondered why you're wearing overalls.
There you go. One of the things that I never see out of any of the political parties is the proper strategy for how we actually get from where we are now to a much greener situation in this country. It's never costed properly, it's not timetabled properly, and there's huge gaps in there which is forgotten. I'll give you a few gaps. The first thing is, if you build a wind farm, that's great, but you have to build the backup. We don't build the backup. You have to shift the grid. We don't talk about shifting the grid. And we shove it not on the energy bill, we shove it on the electricity bill. And that affects, yes, domestic, but it really affects industry as well, as far as competitiveness is concerned. We talk about electric vehicles. That's great. You need lithium batteries. Where are the big lithium refiners in the world? China. Are we really going to hawk ourselves up to China? We've got to build that lithium refiner as well. I will not go on with my list.
And charging points.
I will not go on with my list. But that's what I mean. Let's get the strategy in place. Decide how much it's going to cost, who pays what, the domestic, the business, and what comes out of government. And if you've got a sensible plan and a sensible strategy, people will go with it. And if you don't, they won't.
I think Labour's £28 billion plan is pretty sensible, actually, and I'll be pushing to make sure it's implemented absolutely lock, stock and two smoking barrels.
They're delaying it though, aren't they?
Well, but it needs to be accelerated, needs to be pushed, and obviously that's an ongoing debate in the Labour Party. But the basic premise of creating jobs, building and supporting new industries, and actually doing it through, for example, the creation of a green energy company. Unfortunately, when you were obviously a minister, that was just after the time when we privatised so much of our national utilities, including the grid, and at a time when actually we need to marshal the entire forces of the state to get anywhere near tackling climate change. We're not able to do it. In fact, actually, we're in a situation where most of the country's infrastructure is far behind where it should be, hasn't had the investment, and actually has just been milked for profit.
No, it's not. It's had a lot of investment. You need the plan.
Take the water industry, for example, a complete and utter disaster that's cost us as taxpayers.
We're not going to get into the water industry and national... No. We're not going to get into water industry and privatisation, nationalisation, because we haven't got time. We've just got time for our fun question from Jane in Swindon. Greg Wallace has been pranked on a TV show into thinking he was eating human flesh. He obviously wasn't. Have you been pranked, or are you a secret prankster, Angela Knight?
When I was just out of university, I went to work for Air Products Industrial Gas Company, and they put me on the engineering shop floor of Luton, at Vauxhall Motors at Luton. And I was 22. And this is entirely male. And I was offered a cup of coffee one day. I'd been there about a week. And I was offered a biscuit. And I opened the tub of biscuit, and out flew this huge snake. It wasn't real. It was one, fortunately, it was a spring. And that was the test. Did I laugh or did I get upset? Well, as I'd grown up in an all-male household, I fell about laughing. But that was pretty nasty.
Can you imagine
prank.
if someone did that in a workplace now?
Yes, on a 22-year-old female where everybody else is bloke. Yeah, but there we go. And I have to say, sense of humour and liking red wine are two things that have served me well in this world.
Excellent. Zoe?
I've not been pranked quite so cruelly as that, although it sounds hilarious. I have a real weak spot for watching prank videos, though. There's nothing like I can watch hours of YouTube of just people being scared and falling over, and then being scared again and falling over again. Or have you seen the fake scare one, where there's two people together, they're filming, the other person doesn't know they're filming, and they pretend to be terrified of something and jump and scream and run around. The other person will jump and scream. It's just top content. I absolutely live for it. I live for it.
Oh my God.
Sam?
I'm a bit of a wind-up merchant, but I don't know. I guess I've sort of given up a little bit on pranks, because every time I turn on the radio or the telly in the morning, I think, well, what have the government been up to? No, but it turns out it's not a prank. It's actually real, and sort of satire is now dead, unfortunately.
Oh, come on, you can do better than that.
Oh my God, I hate pranks. I hate practical jokes. I even hate stand-up comedy. I hate surprise parties. I
hate stand-up comedy.
I don't like stand-up comedy. I don't like anything. The idea of watching these prank videos, I don't know whether you're serious, Zoe.
People falling over.
The idea of
over
people
and
being
over again.
funny, or you being a wind-up merchant, honestly leaves me cold.
Well, my best friend and solicitor pranked me once in a very cruel way, and I said, I will get you back for this, but it will be at a time that you don't expect it. 4 years later, I did, and I got someone to phone him up pretending I was in prison in Detroit, and he spent the whole of the day phoning up the MP that I used to work for to talk to the Foreign Office, phoning up the prison in Detroit, and eventually I had to tell him, never prank me.
Are you still friends?
We are.
Excellent.
Yeah, but he hasn't done it since.
That could get messy, though, if that got leaked to the press.
It did
we're
get
trying
quite
to get
messy, because I didn't realise that he would have gone that far. But anyway, I was quite grateful that he did.
Brilliant.
Right, Sam Tarry, Angela Knight, Zoe Gardner and Emma Woolf, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Cross Question. Coming up in the next hour, have you got a beard? If you're in the police force, they don't like beards in the police force. If you've got visible tattoos, your employer might not like it. And what about if you're an RMT member and on your uniform, when you go about your business on the station, you've got a badge saying, stop the ticket office closures? Well, your employers don't like that at all. And Mick Lynch from the RMT is threatening more rail strikes if there's any disciplinary action against his members. It's an interesting subject, this. What power should an employer have over an employee in dictating what they can and can't wear and what they can and can't look like? 0345 6060 973. I don't have a beard. I don't have any tattoos either. Yet.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Labour's urged the government to rethink its travel advice for places like the Greek islands as tens of thousands of Britons' holiday plans remain in doubt. The Foreign Office hasn't advised people to avoid places like Rhodes, which means holidaymakers who do choose not to go could lose their money. Helen Massimo says she had little choice but to cancel her family holiday.
We would have loved to rebook.